Today, we're joined by four prominent authors to chat about the books that they love. First, we have Diana Henriques, an award-winning journalist and best-selling author of The Wizard of Lies. Her in-depth investigation into Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, which was also adapted into an HBO movie, and she just released her latest book, Taming the Street, which is a look at Wall Street's unregulated past. Next, we have Robert Lipsyte, celebrated sports writer and author of The Contender, a classic young adult novel that has sold over 1 million copies, and is a former New York Times columnist who's known for his coverage and biography of Muhammad Ali. We have Brody Mullins, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter formerly with the Wall Street Journal, who's recently released a book about lobbyists called The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. And finally, we have Dr. Catherine Pakaluk, an economist and social philosopher at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., whose work on family and social trends led her to write Hannah's Children, a study of women choosing large families in a world with shrinking fertility rates. And Catherine also received her PhD from Harvard. Let's jump into this. So let's start, since I introduced you first, Diana. I want to start with you, but basically I read like 100 to 150 books a year, and people are always like, Jesse, what books do you recommend? It's like the first thing people ask me, and so I'm always looking for good books. I'm always curious what other people are reading. So let's just start with you, Diana.
First, I'd like to just give a category of books that I would love people to learn more about. Probably the three most influential authors on me as a writer were John McFay, John Brooks, the New Yorker magazine's business writer back in the 50s, and of course Primo Levi, whose accounts of his life as a Holocaust survivor are epic. So, anything by them, I've read everything by them, so anything by them I would recommend. But on recent reads, I think everyone should read American Midnight by Adam Hochschild. It's one of those books that when you finish it, you go back and rethink every biography from the period you've ever read. It looks at the years around World War I and the remarkable collapse of our civil liberties here in this country during that time period. It's a small slice of time, and it's been largely forgotten. But as you read it, you're going back through. Wait a minute, I read a book about this guy that didn't mention what he was doing. So American Midnight is one of my big recommendations. And as you know, in more current work, I'm a big fan of Zeke Fox's Number Go Up on the crypto industry, and Dana Mattioli's book, The Everything War, on Amazon and its confrontation with the Federal Trade Commission. So those are nonfiction recommendations that I think folks might enjoy. And of course, Taming the Street.
Brody, how about you? You go next.
Yeah, I'll go back and stick with Dana Mattioli's book. Dana was a colleague of mine for many years. She wrote a book about Amazon and the rise of Amazon, and most recently the battle between Amazon and the Federal Trade Commission. And what's interesting there is that it's something that we actually include in our book, but it's really about how Washington, for the first time in 50 years, is starting to use antitrust regulations to go after big companies, which is something that could be boring to a lot of Americans, but is incredibly important because these companies have gotten so big and so powerful, led by Amazon in the past 15 or 20 years. And now for the first time, the government is turning against them. And Dana does a great job of chronicling that, how Amazon rose to power, and the questioning really whether it violated its competitors' privacy, really, by kind of stealing products and designs from other companies to make similar products. So anyway, it's a fascinating read. I think will stand the test of time. My favorite book of all time, or I mean, it's hard to say favorite book of all time. One of my favorite books of all time, the book that really got me into covering political journalism was What It Takes by Richard Ben Kramer, who has since passed. He was not only a fabulous writer, but an amazing investigator. And he wrote the best book of all time about the 1988 presidential election. I grew up reading books about presidential elections, especially the books about that making the president 1980 or 1960, making the president 1964, all those great books back then. But the 1988 book it's really about the 88 campaign, but it's really about why people think that they can run for president. All these, every human is flawed in their own way. But in that election, I think there was 8 or 10 Americans who stood up to say, I think I'm the person who can fulfill this job. And it's about their biographies and their roles and how they got to their positions and their personal flaws. And it really was an amazing book about not just about that campaign, but about American politics and the American presidency. So I'd highly recommend that one for anyone who's interested in politics or Washington D.C. And then I've got a bunch of other ones. One of my favorite from this summer is called The Lost Son, which is by a colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal, Brett Forrest, about an American who essentially joined the Taliban and disappeared. That's a pretty fascinating book. And I got others we can talk about later on.
I'm reading a book right now which is over my head. It's not the first time, but it's called The Impusium, and it's by Olga Tokarczuk, recently won a Nobel Prize. It's kind of a feminist retelling of the Magic Mountain, and the big takeaway for me is that it's the first book that I haven't read for purpose in a really long time. And I grew up as a kind of fat, bookish kid who kind of read to be in a corner and to hide out. And the idea of kind of losing the pleasure of reading, the pure sensual, I wouldn't say guilty anymore, pleasure of reading was kind of hard to take. The book that has always meant the most to me was on an emotional level. It was called The Royal Road to Romance. I was 12 or 13 years old. I'd gone into the library, into the science section, which was rare for me, looking for pictures of naked women. And I got a book called The New You and Heredity, which had a masculinity chart. And at the top of the masculinity chart were engineers and test pilots. I knew that was not where I was going. At the bottom of the masculinity chart were teachers and writers, which seemed kind of like, where I would go. And this really bothered me for a long time. I couldn't even tell my dad about it because he was a teacher. I didn't want to, upset him. But I went back to the library to the travel section and found this book, The Royal Road to Romance. It was about a travel writer, who would strap his backpack, put his knife in his teeth, and swim across crocodile-infested waters, maybe stopping to carve up a croc, and then get to the other end and write about it. Hey, you wouldn't put him at the bottom of the masculinity chart. And that became, kind of a talisman to me over the years. First of all, the book was totally specious. He made up most of the stories. He himself was, debunked, years before his suicide. But it carried me over into another world where I felt that you could be a writer and you could be a man and you could have adventures. And that's really all I ever wanted to do. So everything else, I love Steinbeck. Hemingway screwed me up for a while. I went through, I think, all the portals that we do. But I remember those books most vividly and still kind of, draw number one, sustenance from them, and two, I think it's why I drifted into young adult literature, because I thought here was a way to talk to boys. And if boys need novels, boys need stories about social dynamics, boys, need support in so many ways. And I thought this would be a wonderful way to do it without having to swim across crocodile-infested water.
I'm busy taking notes from all of the other panelists here. Like, these are some of these books I don't know, and so I like to pick them up. I think I'll start with two that I really have that had a huge effect on me when I was younger, and then maybe I'll just give a couple things that have influenced me as a writer today. So one is when I read in college, backpacking around Europe with no money and on trains, and it was just in my backpack for a whole summer. But it just there was me before this book and me after this book. So this is Cancer Ward by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And I've just recently picked it up again. I've been afraid to reread it. And I don't know if the other authors here have that thought, like a book that sort of holds a sacred space for you. And do you reread it, and will it be different, or will you be disappointed in it? Or, but anyway, Cancer Ward is just so interesting. It's a piece of historical fiction by Solzhenitsyn, but of course, much of it could be true. The characters are outstanding. The themes are completely epic, suffering, the Soviet state, but actually I think it's much more of a reverie on the way in which bureaucracy kind of eats people up and impersonalizes them. And so I think if we're not worried about sort of socialism proper, but we're thinking about the trouble with bureaucracy and kind of big impersonal institutions, which I think is something we worry about a lot today, it's totally relevant. And so I handed it to my son recently, who was backpacking around the United States, and he's calling me from tents in the middle of the night saying, "Mom, I got to read this passage to you." So I think it's really quite, I think it's lasted the test of time. So that's Cancer Ward. And then the other one by Sigrid Undset, I read Kristin Lavransdatter right around the time I had my first kid. And so this is a book that won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And Sigrid Undset is a 20th century female writer who wrote these just epic, long books about medieval Norway. And Kristin Lavransdatter is probably her most well-loved. She has a bunch of other ones. She tends to write things that are very dark, engaged with kind of all of the intrigue of medieval Norway. And it follows this young woman from when she gets married to when she dies. Actually, it's really quite an epic story. And so Kristin Lavransdatter is what it's called. Again, I recommend it to all my students, and I've reread it several times, and it's just sort of, again, really super relevant. Very interesting book to read as a young mom, because I was just coming to grips with what it meant to be a mother, to face the reality of the mortality of her children, right? So she's sort of facing those questions. Once your kid is born, you realize the worst thing that could happen to you is not that you would die, but that your kid would die or suffer. And that's this very profound shift in thinking. And so she grapples with that. And I really found that amazing. So those are two books that really I would sort of mark before and after my life. And I've thought a lot about them. In terms of books that have influenced me today and how I think about my writing, probably in part because of those older books, but narrative really matters a lot to me. And I think I'm really quite interested in the way in which narratives carry deep ideas for us, because they build these structures in our imagination. And so I'd really want to give a nod to John McPhee. Draft Number 4 is just a phenomenal book on writing. Yeah, I was going to say, Diana. Yeah, and I've probably read that book, 8 times. I just think he's such a genius, but it's also got so much wisdom about how to write and the process of writing. So it really influenced me a lot. A book that's a little quirky and different, but along the same vein, is called Telling True Stories. And that's by Mark Kramer and Wendy Call. It's kind of a collection of essays about the difficulty of being a journalistic writer and trying to tell the stories of other people without getting in the way. And that, that's the trouble as somebody who uses interviews. So of course I'm an academic, but the qualitative work I've done makes use of these long form interviews. So I think it resembles a lot of the kind of work that great journalists do. So I benefited a lot from that. And then as a work of social science, a book called Promises I Can Keep, which is about 20 years old now, was for me the book that really said to me I could do a different kind of social science work. that incorporated stories, but also engaged like bigger social trends. Promises I Can Keep. It was written by Catherine Eden and Maria Kafalis. And I feel like it was written 5 years ago. It's still very relevant, but it really, to me, I read it when I was still in graduate school and I was supposed to be crunching numbers. And I thought, okay, these guys are doing social science and they're just telling stories. And I thought this is the way to do it. So it definitely marked the future of my career, and I'm still exceedingly grateful for their work. So those are some highlights.
Can I jump in for 1 second? So we mentioned draft number 4. I was not thinking about books about writing books. But if you have not read Robert Caro's book, I think it's called Working. It's the book that he stops writing about Johnson and decides to write a book about how he wrote about Johnson. And I kind of feel like, given his age and given that he's a long way to go, I'd wish he'd sort of focus on getting the rest of the books done, but we'll put that aside for a second. As an investigative reporter, I'm more of a reporter and an investigator than a writer. And his book was more about investigating. And I found so many amazing lessons from it. And one lesson is, not extremely practical, but the amount of time that he would put into interviewing people, interviewing people over and over and over again, asking the same questions over and over and over again, because eventually people give you a little bit more information. So he wouldn't just ask the question once or talk to one person one time. He'd talk to him, dozens of times. And, who has that kind of time? Nobody. But, it was a great lesson in investigative tactics. Also, when he wanted to learn about how Johnson grew up in Johnson City, Texas, and he wanted to get a feel for Johnson City, Texas, he moved there. He lived there for 2 years. Again, no one can actually do that. But like, what an incredible dedication to reporting. One final note that I remember from this is that, as someone who interviews people a lot, what he would say is that when you're interviewing someone, you sort of want to not invade the awkward space between sentences in a conversation, as in when you ask a question and someone answers it, don't talk, don't jump in when there's that awkward silence. As an interviewer, don't say anything. And oftentimes the other person, in order to break up that awkward silence, will just keep talking. And Caro said that he would take his notebook, and in his notebook, he would continually, during that silence, he would just write SU, SU, SU. And that was writing to him, shut up, shut up, shut up. And the other person would keep talking. And he had these great stories about how he got Johnson's brother actually to open up about, I think, alcoholism by their father and some verbal abuse by their father growing up, simply because he didn't say anything and he let this guy keep talking. Anyway, it's a magical book about the reporting and interviewing process.
I'd like to second what Brody just said. Also, the wonderful thing about Working is that it's also a shortcut to a lot of the Caro books that you probably haven't fully read. I'm a friend of his, and I mentioned this to him once, and he was not amused. So I suggest, one more thing. I was at the Times, Diana was there at the same time. Not only was she a goddess at the Times, but I know that I was continually in awe, Diana, of the stuff that you were doing. I figured you were such a hard-nosed person. You could have taught all of us, including Caro, a lot about hard-nosed, relentless reporting. And it's a pleasure to meet you.
Well, what a sweet thing to say, Bob. And of course, it's entirely mutual. You were the king of sports reporting, as far as I was always concerned, and loved your work.
So that was the toy department.
Yeah,
we really looked up to guys like you.
Well, the goal. I kind of think of the goal that the drive that shaped me as a financial reporter, and now as a kind of recreational financial historian, was this hope of translating a foreign language, finance, the world of Wall Street, economics, banking regulation, to translate it for a general reader. Because it has always frustrated me to such an extent that we know so little about our financial history, and yet it has been so tremendously important. with the FDR book, Taming the Street, I talked to a lot of young people, and in fact, the book was inspired by an interaction on Twitter in which a young guy, active on the street, rebutted a comment I'd made in defense of the SEC, saying, "Oh no, all Franklin Roosevelt gave us was a bunch of red tape and a bunch of bureaucracy, and we don't need any of that." He said, "I can protect myself as an investor by just reading a 10K or a prospectus." And I just, I put my head in my hands. There were no 10Ks or prospectuses issued by companies until Roosevelt. So we don't have an understanding of how deeply the financial policies of our governments are woven into our daily lives, whether it's FDIC protecting our banks or what. But what drove me to try to do that, to try to translate these complexities to an average reader, was McPhee. And what struck me about him, you all, if you're fans, you'll remember his book on fire, on oranges, on the Pine Barrens, just quotidian, basic subjects that he would just open up like a chrysanthemum blooming until you could just see all of these thousands of facets of it, but you never heard him. His prose was like a pane of glass. You could just look right through it to the subject he was writing about. And it's not, Catherine, until these later books where you hear McPhee himself. I had a chance to meet him at Princeton when I did a visiting professorship there. And, he's so engaging in person, but that voice is not in his early books. It's in the books he's writing now about writing. And thank goodness he has written them.
That's so true. I was going to just respond that I think my work as in the classroom has influenced my drive to try to make things more simple and more clear, right? So that's one way in which, teaching undergraduates on a regular basis. A lot of research faculty prefer to teach seniors or juniors because they teach their research electives. I love to teach the 18-year-olds the day they walk in the door, right? Because there's nothing, they don't know anything, so you have to stop. I was talking yesterday with them about interest rates. You jogged my memory, Dana, and they're looking at me blankly. They don't really know anything about interest rates. You go, okay, well, how would I explain this for the first time? And I think that how would I explain this for the first time produces a freshness, which then I think that's the struggle. Bring that to the page, like bring that to your writing. Don't assume anything in your reader. Don't patronize your reader, but don't assume anything. So nothing's too mundane to tell the story about it. Brody, you reminded me of the book that one of the books that really influenced me, this one by Catherine Eden and Maria Kafalis. To your point, they moved into the city. They lived for 5 years with the population they chose to write about. They won a big grant and they moved in. They wanted to write about urban motherhood and why poor women in the urban areas tended to have children before they got married. And nobody had done this before. They just said, we're gonna get a grant and move in. We're gonna get to know people, and then we're gonna write about them. So this idea of like closing the distance between your subject and your writing, it's so interesting. So
I have a question for Bob. You must get asked this all the time. What's your favorite sport to cover? I mean, what to you has the most appeal as a writer to you?
Well, how can I say this delicately? In watching the World Series last night, I was kind of thinking about the problem with watching sports for me is you're kind of thinking, so what's my lead going to be? And that tends to spoil things. And I realized that, most of the time I wasn't rooting at all. I was just hoping that it would end in time that I could make the last plane home. And that was really kind of coverage. I was not a sports fan growing up. I needed a summer job before I went to graduate school. I answered an ad in the New York Times for editorial assistant, which turned out to be copy boy, which is a terrible job. And I hated the job. I hated the people. I was not that interested in sport. However, I fell in love with the times, the whole the cultish aspect of it. I was 19 years old, and it was just really something to hang on to. And, uh, and eventually I found out that sports was really one of the best ways to look at American culture and society through a different lens. And, uh, and that was it. And I've really never fully evolved into a sports fan, except that I've gotten, luckily, to cover some amazing things, including the career of Muhammad Ali. When he first came on the scene, the Times' august boxing writer, a very important man at the time, I must tell you, and he didn't think it was worth his time to fly to Miami to cover this kid who was going to be knocked out in the first round. And so he said those magic words that impelled my career. He said, "Why don't you send the kid on night rewrite? He's not doing anything." So that was it. And so Cassius Clay and I were around the same age. Most of the reporters there were older, important gentlemen. And then Clay made the great career move for me of winning the championship. And I was the important boxing writer. And so that was kind of the beginning and kind of the arc of my career. I left the Times for 20 years, went back when my generation of copy boy took over. And it's been wonderful. But one thing that I did find that was really helpful for a journalist who's writing on deadline is to write something else, to write books or fiction or poems, whatever. I mean, that kind of balance in your life. And then you guys seem all to have figured it all out. It's something wonderful and amazing to be able to do all those different things.
Well, I am impressed at the amazing array of interests just here on the screen. I mean, the breadth. Looking at the lens of American life, actually at the lens of looking at human nature through the lens of sports, through the lens of power, and the manipulation of power, as you do, Brody, through the lens of how people learn and how social groups form and change, Catherine, and me with my financial lens.
Yeah, actually, and what was very interesting was how Kamala suddenly started calling him Coach Waltz, because somehow that gave an added resonance to his authenticity as an American. Wow, I mean, I've covered hundreds, thousands of coaches. Most of them were not really good people. They were exploiters of 18-year-olds. I mean, Catherine, it'd be so much better if you would grant those 18-year-olds before they got to the coach.
Well, but you're right that coach does have that resonance. I've seen the same paradox in entrepreneur. In brilliant tech genius. Yeah, there's an image that conjures up, successful businessman. And as I've said so many times in comments, the notion that being the CEO of a company, especially a private company, prepares you for any other job in life other than king it's just absurd. I mean, it's no training for operating the levers of democracy. It's no training for leading a university with all of its complex, power centers. I've been sitting at the in the front row of this parade of American entrepreneurs and CEO personalities and con men, it must be said, and finding myself amazed that people admire them so uncritically. When in every case, I mean, the clay feet are just easily on display.
Maybe you could tell us, and then maybe you guys would have something to say too, about the billionaires suddenly seems to be taking over aspects of our lives. I mean,
Yeah.
Jeff and Soon.
Yeah. It's the sad thing.
Yeah.
The sad thing, Bob, is it's not new. I mean, the work I did in exploring the 1920s for my book on the financial reforms of the New Deal, that was an era in American life when plutocrats controlled everything. I mean, they told Washington what to do, not the other way around. Their preferences were government's marching orders, and it's documented from one end of the 20s to the other, and so this rise and fall of the powerful plutocrat is something America has always wrestled with. We go through some periods when the common man gets lifted up. I mean, right after 9/11, for example, there were a lot of beautiful books, a lot of wonderful journalism, but some, I'm thinking of our colleague Anthony De Palma's book, City of Dust, where everyday people who put their lives on the line to serve us and to help us get lifted up. And we remember, oh yeah, they really matter. And then the pandemic, where our healthcare workers, our garbage collectors, our police officers, our first responders, and we said, oh yeah, they really make the world run. And then we forget, and we're right back to googling-eyed at Elon Musk. So it's the pixie dust of wealth, it's the pixie dust of celebrity. But I keep thinking that we all, as writers, I think, need to do more to put the ordinary American, the romance, the drama, the importance of the ordinary American, the very extraordinary ordinary American, back front and center.
You have something you want to say, Dr. Catherine?
Oh, I'm nodding along. I agree with that tremendously, that one of the great roles of the writer is to put the ordinary into the imagination, to create a romance around things that we miss. Right. So I really agree with what you just described so much. And I have a lot to aspire to, following in your footsteps and Bob's. And Brody, I haven't read your book, but I will have to do that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Well, one of the things we actually get into is sort of the billionaire class, as we talked about, now dominating politics more and more in the last few years. So I know that companies and billionaires dominated, in the early 19th century. I feel like for a lot, or 20th century, I feel like a lot of our history in the last 100 years has been companies and billionaires have not had a ton of influence until the 1970s or 80s. And really, companies had a lot of influence during that period. But now it seems like these billionaires are coming out of nowhere. And in part, it's because of, this is a little dorky, but about our campaign finance system, that companies and CEOs and corporate executives are giving money in a way that's regulated by the Federal Election Commission, so they can only give a certain amount of money. But billionaires are going outside of the system to these super PACs that we've heard about. So let's just pick a company, Microsoft. If Microsoft wants to get involved in the election, it essentially gives money through its political action committee, which is capped at giving, I think, about $3,300 to a candidate. So Microsoft's PAC can give $3,300 to Donald Trump or Kamala Harris or whatever. Then they can give a couple, maybe tens of thousands of dollars to the political party. That's it. Elon Musk is giving $75 million. Because he's not going through the normal system, he's going through a super PAC. So that has allowed these billionaires to have way more influence in our politics in the last couple of years than before. And to me, what's also troubling is that, lots of people blame companies for the problems that we have today. But when companies get involved in elections, they give to Republicans, they give to Democrats. Their donations are regulated by or governed by, not just the rules and the disclosure laws, but, they have boards and they have employees and they have directors and they have shareholders. They have all sorts of people who don't want them to give to extreme candidates. Billionaires don't have that. They can do whatever they want and they have no accountability, which makes the prospect of billionaires controlling elections a lot scarier?
Well, you just made me scarier. So what do you think is now your role? I mean, you were great in exposing the people who are really supporting, and those K Street guys work for those billionaires. They are spreading their gospel. So what's your role?
So I think, my job is sort of, chronicle the power in DC and the changes in power. And I feel like on a positive note, I feel like that we're sort of entering potentially another progressive era where we see more and more Republicans and Democrats who are turning against corporate America. The Elizabeth Warren sort of anti-business side of the Democratic Party is getting louder and more powerful. And the populist side of the Republican Party, I mean the corporate populist side, economic populism is getting growing in strength, including with people like J.D. Vance, who right now or a few months ago was just a regular U.S. senator, but all of a sudden might be a lot more powerful. A lot of those sides, the progressive left and the populist right, are coming together on pro-worker, anti-corporate legislation. And this is sort of happening behind the scenes without people noticing, I think. But, Josh Hawley, who we all remember from the January 6th riot, he has 3 different bills right now with Elizabeth Warren that would help regular Americans. One that would cap bonuses for big banks, another that would cap debit card fees, another would make it easier for people to join labor unions. These are all things that you would think Elizabeth Warren would support, and she does, but not Josh Hawley. And there's 4 or 5 or 6 Republicans in the Senate who are with Josh Hawley, including J.D. Vance. So there's a beginning of this economic populism in both parties that actually could, it's hard to predict the future, but it just seems like there's this backlash against companies that is translating into potentially more pro-worker, pro-consumer legislation, which we've not had, in 50 years in our country.
Well, just a little caveat about that. Watch what happens to the National Labor Relations Board, too. It's very easy to talk about your concern about the workers. The plutocrats in the 1920s did, too. But then if the workers tried to form a union, they cracked their heads open. So, I think I recommend, since we're supposed to be talking books, I recommend Steve Greenhouse's work on the American labor movement. Steve worked with Bob and I at the Times for many years. One of the greatest labor writers, labor reporters that we've ever seen. And he's very clear about the fact that there's lip service and then there's actual commitment. And if you look at, for example, some of the policy statements coming out of the more conservative think tanks, there's almost no support for organized labor. There's almost no lip service even to organized labor anymore. So let's use that maybe as a litmus test and educate ourselves about the working man with Steve's book. I should know the name of it, and it's not right at the tip of my tongue, but I will get it before we're done.
You go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just wondering, there's a looming event coming up. I don't know if we will be on the air before or after it happens. And I just wondering how, 3 such really involved and engaged writers as you guys, are preparing for that, either personally or professionally.
Well,
what are you going to do?
I'm going to explore writing fiction.
Well, let me just say that I have a book coming out in January, a new young adult that happens in just before the 2016 election. And I must say, the reason that I said it there was I realized that real life was going to be so far ahead of anything that I could imagine in fiction that I had to go back into the past.
Yeah.
So,
By the way, Steve Greenhouse's book is beaten down, worked up, a history of the American, the past, present, and future of the American labor movement. So, if you want to learn more about where organized labor fits into our financial history, that's a great book. I'm only partly joking about the fiction project. I do want to explore some of the landscape I covered in a nonfiction way in the 1920s, in a fictional way. So that is my project. But also I've been thinking a lot about resources for creativity and happiness, that will see me through. Puppies, for example, whoever's puppy is that's all right. Yes. It could have been mine. I mean, we've got a cute little puppy that brightens every day. So that's one of the things I'm doing, is looking for ways outside the urgency of daily politics.
Yeah.
To be creative.
Yeah. Well, I teach students every day, and the nice thing about college is that the courses we teach stay the same pretty much from year to year, and there's something stable about that. And I think that that's a big piece of kind of getting through these election cycles that are so divisive, is to help young people see that actually the sun still rises, and that most of the things that make our lives meaningful and wonderful are really disconnected from the political cycle, and they're not. So it's just not to downplay the importance of elections at all, at all, but also to just help people see beyond the next week. So, and my students, I'm actually sometimes encouraged by how little they follow the day-to-day zingers, the back and forth. They haven't heard of garbage trucks, and the current. They just aren't following that closely, which seems like maybe a good thing.
Agreed. Could we talk a little bit just about one of the books that got me through the 2016 post-election days? Was A Gentleman in Moscow by Amor Towles, which is one of my absolute favorite novels of all time, because it is about the effort to live a decent life in indecent times. And I just curled up with it, and it gave me hope for going forward. I'm also recommending, and I think this should be everybody's look, is World War Z. Pay no attention to the movie of the same name. It bears no resemblance to the novel. It's a Studs Terkel-like account of the Great Zombie War 10 years later. And it exposes what people value when they are facing an existential threat. Who is of value? It will be no surprise to you to know, Brody, that the billionaires who don't actually know how to do anything practical don't fare very well in the aftermath of the great zombie wars. So these are two wonderful books that I think will help all of us make it through the coming days.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to get closer to my plumber. He'll be very important, I know. But I'm nervous about the election. On the other hand, I remember at the time that we had that saying, I don't want the world to end. But if it is going to end, I want it to end on my shift.
We used to fantasize about who would be your reporting team to cover the end of the world. And it was always fun. Bob, you've been on my list.
I read the New York Times list one year of the best fiction classic books to read, and I think for a lot of younger people, the classics can kind of seem daunting. So, what would and of that 100 classical books that I read, I would say that 90 I did not enjoy too much. Like Don Quixote is actually one of my favorite books. I mean, Catch-22 is really good. Dorian Gray I thought was really good. Count of Monte Cristo I thought was really good. But for you, I mean, since we're talking about books, let's kind of refocus here. What are some of your favorite classics that, and like the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, I thought was really good. But what are some classics that you would actually recommend?
Well,
I think
before you say that, I think that what you may have touched on is that we read the books at the wrong time. I mean, to read some of those books in middle school and high school, when we're not really, we don't have enough life experience to really appreciate it. Don Quixote made no sense to me, even in college. I mean, but I reread it a few years ago, and I thought it was a wonderful book. And I have had that kind of experience that these days I'm rereading old books and finding things in it that I had no idea what they were about. So I think that really is the key, to read it in its time. Old people understand books better. It's too late to do anything about it.
Well, you kind of you indicted me. Actually, everything that I listed was a 20th century book, and so I'm a big fan of George Eliot. Loved Middlemarch. Really loved Silas Marner, even though I read Silas Marner when I was too young, and recently have pulled that back out. And I think she's brilliant, and her writing is just terrific. So I'm a big fan of George Eliot. And if there's listeners out here that haven't picked up Middlemarch, I think is just a great, great story. But Silas Marner, I feel like really has a lot to say about our time. Those are two that are off the top of my head that I think most people don't encounter.
Trollope. A Trollope. I adore Trollope. The Barchester Chronicles, the political novels especially. I mean, he was prolific. He was almost a factory, a book factory, but he just somehow speaks to me. And I think the human dramas that he plays out are just timeless, absolutely timeless. The local church politics in a little Anglican, cathedral town in mid-19th century England. Today, I mean, it's just absolutely so current and modern. So Trollope is my go-to.
I had a similar experience in high school where I didn't like any of the classic books. I thought they were too hard to get through, and I guess I just wasn't ready for them. But luckily, in the last couple of years, maybe starting 5 years ago, I started going back and sort of picking them off and trying to figure out why I didn't like these books. And all the Steinbeck books are awesome. And what's also amazing is that so many of these books in high school I couldn't get through are incredibly short.
That's
they're not long.
That's true.
They just seem long back then. So you can almost read them in an afternoon or certainly a weekend. Instead of like binging a Netflix show, you can just read Old Man and Sea. It probably takes about the same amount of time. So it is funny. I agree that we were forced to read these books, some of us at least, too early.
Yeah, I think most of them are short, except like Don Quixote. I think is 2 parts. I think that book's like 1,000 pages. Three Musketeers, I believe, is fairly long. And Tolstoy, of course, I mean, he's got some like Anna Kay. Unless you're reading the abridged version, I mean, you might as well spend like like a 4-day weekend on that one.
But you could read Stendhal faster. I mean, you could read The Red and the Black or The Charterhouse of Parma and relive the same exciting stories of yesteryear.
And Vanity Fair was a book that I would read every few years because it seemed contemporary. And I would learn more as I had grown the book grew. And Steinbeck, which was always a favorite of mine. And then going back and being really disappointed with Hemingway. I mean, which told me maybe I had started to grow up.
I never could get Hemingway, but I think it if you were a high school female, Hemingway was a very hard swallow, particularly when Jane Austen was the alternative. I mean, that just not to say that she was the original chick lit, but she certainly, to me as a high school reader, was far more accessible. But another book that I think both Bob and Brody are right about that we read too wrong. I went back and read it recently for research for the books I'm working on now, is The Great Gatsby. Kids reading that when they have no understanding of the crime milieu of prohibition, of the these disparities of wealth that started to emerge in the 20s. I mean, it's what would be the point even of reading The Great Gatsby if you didn't have that grounding in it? So that's one that I read too early, went back and read again, and now have read for the third time, and it grows in depth.
Well, that was really in your wheelhouse by then.
It was, and it was so funny. It was narrated by a bond salesman. And the reason that Fitzgerald made Nick, the bond salesman, the narrator, was bond salesmen didn't have a lot to do. So they had a lot of free time to hang out with Gatsby.
In the long run, I tend to think that the most influential writer of our time was probably Judy Blume. When you realize the way that she reached into the lives of a lot of girls, hopefully some boys, but mostly girls, half the population, and in really kind of meaningful, you're okay, you're going to be okay kind of ways that most of the rest of fiction was not really doing. And the books that a lot of these girls were being fed were these high school and middle school books that were too early. With all regards to Silas Marner, I think you're not allowed to read it till you're after 50.
Well, I'm getting close. I'm getting close, Bob. So.
Well, you're a prodigy, so you were.
I'm dangerously close. So maybe that's why I like it now. I think it's just terrific. Yeah.
I kind of like Bob's question, though. You want to take it, Catherine? Who is the most influential writer of our times? I mean, I guess for all of us are different ages, so that could be in different time frames.
Yeah.
But.
I was thinking just now, I don't know why Malcolm Gladwell, I think, has made a tremendous impact on a lot of people. Who else? Maybe J.K. Rowling. I mean, if we're going to say who's influenced just in terms of numbers, J.K. Rowling is certainly someone that comes to mind.
She wrote other stuff besides Harry Potter too, right? Or was that her most famous? I actually never read Harry Potter or seen the movies.
Interesting. So. Altogether, I don't think it quite accumulates to the length of The Count of Monte Cristo, but it's certainly it's getting close. Or the multiple sagas there. No, I don't know how much else she's written. I'm not somebody who follows her work very closely, but as somebody who's been teaching young people for such a long time, if I were to poll my students, J.K. Rowling is probably the closest thing to an author that has been universally read by people under the age of 30, I think.
Well,
that's a really good pick. And I think she was also a gateway writer to lead a lot of people into reading big fact.
Absolutely. I think for my generation, and I'm in my mid-70s, Tom Wolfe would have to be put forward as just there's before him and then there's after him in terms of narrative nonfiction.
Yeah, I should have remembered Tom Wolfe.
He just completely changed the game, and with great controversy. Actually, having lived through that time as a very young writer, so Tom Wolfe certainly was I thought a remarkable influence. And then you just sort of have the tension between the Norman Mailer and the Gore Vidal schools of social commentary, which also I think, I don't know, maybe had some negative influence, if that's a thing. People not wanting to do one or the other. But those would be the three names that really appeal to me.
Great suggestions. Yeah.
And that was the time, too, when nonfiction began to, I think, supersede fiction.
I think you're right. Good
point.
And
Brody, what about for you?
It's so hard to pick one person. All the names we mentioned are terrific. I don't think that Michael Lewis is the greatest of all time, but he's one of the, I really like his books. I think Malcolm Gladwell's a good one, but that's also, I think, kind of a specific generational. He certainly doesn't fit in the category of some of these other giants, but someone who is certainly impactful and followed by it. It's hard to, I mean, if we had to come up with a list of a top 100, we could probably do it, but top one is too much.
I guess it depends how you look at this question. I guess for me, I would think at least for me, it'd be Stephen King, just because so many of his books have been adapted into movies, and he's so varied. Like, he wrote The Green Mile, he wrote Shawshank Redemption, and then of course people think of like Carrie or It, and then on the Hulu show was it 11/22/63, the day that JFK was assassinated. Then he turned that into a show, which was actually really interesting. But he's like written, I don't know, probably 100 books over his life, and how many of them have been turned into movies that people would never even, like Green Mile, no one thinks that's Stephen King.
That's a great idea. Yeah.
But haven't we been blessed?
Right?
My goodness. When the generations we reflect here on this screen, to have them as our classics. You think the people who were living when Dickens was writing, the people who were living when George Eliot was writing, were they as aware as we can be now with modern media that these giants are emerging in our culture? But look at the list we've suggested here. I mean, you could read round the clock for the rest of your lives and not do it justice, right? It's
well, you probably should.
Yeah, I've got the T-shirt. So many books, so little time. Right?
Hey, Catherine, how much time do you have left?
T-minus 2 or 3 minutes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I know that you said you have to get going. So just leave us with. You can leave first. Just leave us with a final thought about this topic, and then just kind of give people where they can find you, that kind of information.
I think that especially, again, I'm thinking a lot about the younger generation, and I think the pull between screens and devices and books has become really like I think it's like the drama that's going to shape a lot of the future in terms of how people are being formed, not by books the way I was, but by snippets of things, and they're not complete stories. And people say they're not complete thoughts, but actually they're not complete stories, right? I don't think stories can be told in a tweet or post or a caption on an Instagram. So I guess my closing thought is that if people are struggling to learn to read or to get into books, is to kind of like think about that struggle and find ways to get the devices turned off. I mean, there's a lot of things. There's like bricks, these things that go on your phone, and but find a way to get yourself an hour. And actually, sort of, I'm here to say, like, you're gonna love it, right? You're gonna love it. But yeah, I think I think it's worth saying it out loud. I think it's really worth saying out loud that the younger generation, and not that much younger than me, right? So not that much younger, that's the thing that is blocking their entryway. Like Diana said, we're so blessed. Their entryway into this incredible world, which is amazing. If it's audiobooks, if that's what it takes, to go with the audiobooks. So anyway, now that's my final thought is kind of like, do the work, put the time in. It's so worth it and so wonderful. And I mean, I would be a different person without the books that have accompanied me. They're kind of like friends, right? They sit on your shelf, right? I look around my house, and that's like the first thing we build when we move. It's like, yes, I love it, Diana. So that's my final thought. And then, you can find my book on Amazon, and I have a really undeveloped website, so don't go there. But Amazon, I know I post from time to time on X, but I'm not like a maven on X. So Amazon is a good place for now. And I guess in the spirit of things, I'll recommend the audio version of my book, because so much of my book is stories, and the reader was wonderful. It's not me, but she's wonderful. So thanks everybody. I took all kinds of notes about books that I haven't read. I'm gonna read Robert Caro's book on writing right away, Brody. So that's like, it's in my cart already. So anyway, thank you so much. I really benefited and learned a lot, and I enjoyed seeing everybody.
So my final thought is my favorite guilty pleasure book of the last year is The Devil at His Elbow by my colleague Valerie Bauerlein, which is about the Alec Murdaugh murder in South Carolina a couple years ago. I think we all sort of followed this in the news, and I kind of thought I knew the story, and she really dove into it. She covered it for the Wall Street Journal and wrote this terrific book. It's really less about a murder or a double murder, and more about money, power, and influence of a big time wealthy family in a small town, and how that wealth going back generations and generations can really pervert justice for many, many years in this small town. I thought it was terrific. I'd highly recommend it. Again, Devil at His Elbow by Valerie Bauerlein. I think it's a New York Times bestseller as well, so you might have heard of it. And you can contact me. I'm on Twitter at Brody Mullins DC, and I have a website, brodymullins.co. Thanks very much.
Well, your final thoughts. As Catherine so eloquently said, I just pray we don't lose this capacity for sustained attention to long-form stories, to long-form narrative, because they so enrich your lives. I understand the importance of practical knowledge, particularly for young people. The STEM studies, the focus on sciences, the focus on practical knowledge, but it doesn't do you a lot of good to know how to do things if you don't know why to do them or not do them. So the liberal understanding of ethics and human nature and human history, I think, is essential to how we use technology. And as artificial intelligence emerges, that's going to become even more important. So I remember an old ad. You'll remember this, Bob, the old ad that used to run in the New Yorker and the magazines. You'd see a CEO talking to his human resources person, and I'm going to change the gender to make it more friendly. But he said, "Send me a person who reads." That was the sine qua non. That was the foundation level requirement for success in life. Send me a person who reads. So I'm hoping that we can have new generations of people who read.
Well, I had a wonderful experience during COVID, of all things, when every single day at 4:00, I read to my then 8-year-old grandson. I read the books of Rick Riordan, Percival Jackson and the Olympians, kind of, fantastical sword books. He did not read. He did not believe in reading. He refused to read. It was a great problem in a family of readers. And in the course of a year of reading to him, he got his own Kindle, and he began to read ahead of what I was reading to him. It almost became a competition. And now he reads too much. We're trying to kind of, a little more baseball. But no. So I think that, reading to kids as a start of getting them into the story and the language and the rhythms of all, I think really kind of works. I think it was wonderful. It transformed a lot of people in my family.
Beautiful.
Did any one of you want to leave us with where people can find you, that kind of information as well?
I'm sorry, working with what?
Where people can find you, get a hold of your books, that kind of information?
Well, bless Jeff Bezos, Amazon.
Right.
I've written too many books, but the latest YA, Rhino's Run, is probably there. And I want to thank you for this opportunity to talk and to meet all these people and to finally meet one of my heroines of journalism. It's really very nice. It really is, Diana.
Thank you, Bob.
You were great inspiration, and also I kind of, why can't I be more like her? Well, I don't have her guts. That's what it is.
Bless your heart. You're a prince. You are a prince. Jesse, people can find me at dianabhenriques.com. They can read for free the first chapter of Taming the Street on the website. See if it suits their tastes. And my other books are all featured there, as well as long as a few snippets from the HBO movie on the with Bernie Madoff. I got to play myself opposite Robert De Niro, which was really kind of cool. But that's where they can find more about me.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.